So yeah, this is my book. I'm the author of Future Sex. It's published in Dutch by Amsterdam University Press, and this is the American edition. I started writing Future Sex when I turned 30, and I had just gotten dumped by a boyfriend, and I got tired of waiting to fall in love and get married. That had been my goal for my adult life besides my professional aspirations, and it wasn't working out for me. And here there was all of this sexual freedom and possibility that I didn't value. I had, at that point, I'd never internet dated. I didn't watch internet pornography. I thought open relationships were fine for other people, but not for me. I was just not a very sexually adventurous person. And yet I had total freedom. I could do whatever I wanted, and I didn't value it. So I started to think about that freedom and what it meant. And I became, as I thought about it and I began working on the book, I realized I was not alone, that the world had changed. There was a demographic shift of people getting married much later or not at all, and having children much later, and spending more time in their life alone, which meant a different kind of sexual relationship, more short-term relationships, more dating, whatever you wanted to call it. The technology had changed. There was new ways to meet people. There was new ways to explore your sexual fantasies. There were new communities to be found online. And there had been a change in morality, an opening up of a new diversity in sexual identities, understanding about sexual orientation, new language around gender, and different kinds of families, different kinds of partnerships. And I had just thought of myself as not interested in all of that. And so now I decided, using journalism as a little bit of an alibi, I let myself begin exploring some of these possibilities. First by meeting people who were living these lifestyles, and then by considering some of those practices myself. This lecture, I'm going to focus on a thing I discovered that I call the clean, well-lighted space, which is a kind of marketing concept, I would say, related in particular to female sexuality. So as I was researching all this stuff, I also started looking at the history of things. So when I started internet dating, I looked at the history of internet dating. And what I learned was that from the very beginning in the early to mid 90s, there was a big problem for these companies to get women to sign up in equal numbers as men. And that was because the internet started in fields that had, structurally excluded women, like engineering and the military. But it also had to do with feelings of safety and comfort that women were not experiencing when they went online. So recruiting women became like the main goal of any internet dating company that appealed to heterosexuals. And this is an early ad from the 90s in San Francisco from a company called Match.com. This is how they designed the very first internet dating profiles to be very friendly. From the beginning, they realized they needed to put the websites on a white background instead of a black background. That made people feel more safe. They put this like heart logo. They allowed you to like talk about your interests and where you went to college, and you could pretend that you were on there to find an activity partner instead of for dating, all of which was to address women in particular, their insecurities about seeming desperate or encountering pornographic material online when they didn't want to, all of that. So this is another marketing thing. So it's just like love is the first word you see. Again, they needed to create a culture on internet dating of like romance, destigmatize it, safety, and they put all this like practical stuff in place. Like you couldn't at that point you couldn't exchange photos anyway, but you couldn't Sexually explicit photos were banned. You could block people. You know, they emphasized all this like romance and love. And yeah, they called this marketing concept the clean, well-lighted space. And, you know, yeah, no pornographic images, a white screen background instead of a black one, a reclamation of sexuality from sleaze. So nothing that felt, yeah, again, kind of like a strip club or like too pornographic. And yeah, a sex-free environment in which to consider people you might want to have sex with. That was kind of established in the early days of internet dating, and it continues now. So when you look at, do you guys, have any of you internet dated here? Okay. And I hope these aren't too American, these companies, but they're multinational corporations. So when you go into the environment of a mainstream dating app these days, the clean, well-lighted space still holds true. You know, you have these like clean interfaces. You are not allowed to use anything sexually explicit. You'll immediately get banned from the site. You know, the atmosphere is like very friendly. There's hearts. You know, even though Tinder, for example, when Tinder started, people were like, oh, it's a hookup app, it's a casual sex app. The company was very, very, very careful to make sure there was no indication of that in any of their advertising. So, you know, this ad for the company I find really funny because it's like, it actually benefited the company to be as bland and asexual and unthreatening as possible. So you have this guy, he's like an emphasis on interesting people doing interesting things, you know, this like very bland marketing concept. And this is another company that's new in the US called Bumble. It's like one of the fastest growing dating apps right now. And the conceit of this app is that the woman has to make the first move. So again, even today, there's just so much emphasis on making women feel comfortable, designing an interface so that women can block people they don't like, so that they can reject people and feel comfortable about that, and so that they can go on without having to declare anything about themselves sexually. And yeah, so like this app, Bumble, doesn't even allow shirtless selfies because so many women find that distasteful, or you're not allowed a bathroom mirror selfie, sorry. So as I started reading about all of this, it struck me that yes, on the one hand, this was about addressing the ingrained misogyny of the internet and you know, addressing, you know, creating a more woman-friendly environment, but there was also a way in which I found it really depressing because to me, a lot of this reflected gendered fears about being sexually open, about being sexually expressive. You know, if one photo of a dick pic is so traumatizing to you, what does that mean about how sexually comfortable you feel? And you know, and the truth was, when sites led with more like traditional, like male heterosexual desire, that kind of imagery, women did not sign up for them. So this site has, yeah, somebody hacked it. It turned out there was 16 men for every one woman with a profile on this site. This was a cheating site called Ashley Madison. It was about having an affair. There was no women on this site. I mean, and look at, you can tell, like, it was so misogynistic, and it just led with this like male identity, and women just didn't sign up for it. When you take women out of the occasion, when you take women out of it, these rules change completely. So the apps for men seeking men are much more like, they basically kind of don't have any rules. You can exchange photos within the apps. You can exchange shirtless photos. You can exchange naked photos. The rule about the white screen background doesn't apply here. Like, they use a dark screen background. It's like a much more liberated space. And the more I thought about this, I don't think it's just like biological determinism. I don't think it's just like this because men have more testosterone. I think, it began to feel like the clean, well-lighted space was not actually a liberated space. It was actually a way to, again, to just address women's own insecurities and fears. So it turns out this clean, well-lighted space is not just in internet dating, it's also in internet pornography. So sorry I censored this. I didn't want to make anybody uncomfortable. Some of you will be familiar with this homepage. So Pornhub is a multi-billion-dollar company. It's a massive company, and yet it, I think, deliberately makes its website look like it's like in a basement somewhere to give you that like extra sense of taboo. Women-led pornography companies. This is a woman named Erica Lush. She makes like feminist porn. So again, look at the design of this website. It's clean. It feels safe. There's no sexually explicit imagery there on the homepage. This is the website of a queer pornographer named Shine Louise Houston, who makes really cool movies. But again, like, it's pink and white. It's like, it's super safe. Yeah, and this is it also applied to sex toys. So, this image on the right is from a store called Good Vibrations. And so like the whole promise of a feminist sex toy was that it was like, it was good in the sense that it's not heteronormative. If you aren't into men, you don't have to think about men with these dildos. But on the other hand, again, it seemed to be like hiding something to me the more I thought about it. So yeah, the clean, well-lighted space, I think, had its moment. We live now, it helped liberate the internet from like super pornographic, misogynistic imagery that kept women from engaging with this technology in its earliest days. And now what I see is maybe more of a willingness to let go of some of those principles. This is an app I find interesting. It's for people interested in like non-traditional relationships. It's called Field. And one thing I liked about this is that it doesn't, this is like a woman who wants to date a couple. So it has some of the hallmarks of the clean, well-lighted space, but it's also a little more open-minded, a little less heteronormative. It's not just like happy couples. It's not just romance. There's language in there so that you can express your identity as polysexual or bisexual or straight or bi-curious. There's just more in there that allows for a greater sense of freedom. This is a new ad campaign by OkCupid that's like everywhere in the New York subway right now. DTF, for if you're not an English speaker, is like a text acronym that means down to fuck, and it's kind of like shorthand for like hookup culture. And they're like playing with that and with a kind of exhaustion around that idea that internet dating has become all about casual sex and not about feelings. But it's still a sexually forward campaign, and but it plays with it. And the other thing I like about this campaign is you may notice the fingernails on the person with the suit. So it's not gender conforming. This couple, you don't really know what gender the person in the wheelbarrow is. In this photo, you might notice there's an extra pair of hands. So I like this because it is the clean, well-lighted space, but it's not as conservative, and it's not as closed-minded as those old ads, which even though those were general interest dating sites, you never saw a gay couple. You only saw like these kind of like straight, like clean people hanging out with each other in this like asexual way. So the conclusion is that the technology, sometimes people think that there's a new technology, it's going to change everything, but actually most technology doesn't catch on unless it addresses people's ingrained insecurities and fears. People really want to feel normal when they use these apps. They don't want to feel transgressive often. They don't want to feel weird. You know, even though I came to see that as kind of lame, it's there, and if you want a popular app, you have to address all of those feelings. You know, even sexually adventurous women will use an app that, you know, if somebody shares their photo from it on an internet, like on the, you know, on social media, they're not going to be outed as some kind of sexually transgressive person. They won't be, you know, professionally affected by the way they go about internet dating. You know, apps that are more sexually forward tend to address, if they're successful, they tend to use the language and ethical systems of like existing sexual communities. So a BDSM community, a polyamorous community, there's a lot of vocabularies and rules in those communities that when you see those words and you see that vocabulary, you know you're within a kind of a system where people agree on a certain ethical model of free sexuality. And then finally, in these discoveries in the online dating system about what make women in particular feel safe online, you know, the internet is a very misogynistic place. We know very well about all of the attacks on social media that you can get as a woman, you know, the threats and all of that. And it's really in the online dating industry, because they had to place such an emphasis on attracting women, that you find some of the best tools for how to make a less misogynistic internet. But unfortunately, a lot of those rules come in the form of prohibitions and censorship. And I'd like to think that in the future, you know, sexual freedom won't look like banning a shirtless bathroom selfie, that won't be threatening, that will be, you know, part of being a sexual person is enjoying that. And, you know, that there will be less controls and less safeguards, and that people will instead feel more comfortable looking at some sexually explicit stuff that doesn't feel threatening. And, you know, the other thing about the clean, well-lighted space that sometimes depressed me was it was so gendered, and it insisted on a certain binary that men and women see sex differently and go about courtship differently and flirting. And again, I'm an optimistic person, and I'd like to think that we can move beyond that. So some of those like last few slides that I showed were kind of exciting to me, because they were in a playful and still, you know, unthreatening way, we're allowing for greater sexual diversity and sexual adventurousness. So, yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you. Hi. So, so yes, let's use this couch. We were just looking at the couch and realized that this is a setup we were, but I always, do you know, a couch on a stage is a bit of an ambivalent thing, because it's homey and comfy, but we're being looked at. I'm not sure if I'm going to be doing this, or
I'm leaning back.
yeah, let's lean back. So for everyone, we have about 20 minutes for a Q&A. I would like to start it off, but if you have any questions, raise your hands. I will try to keep an open eye to you as well. First, I have a question that I think comes in two bits. That in your book, at the start of your book, you describe a world I think we might recognize, like a world where everything goes, where there's so many possibilities through technology, our access to, thank you, visual culture, pornography, internet dating, but also all kinds of spiritual practices engaging with sexuality. So there is this sense, this overwhelming sense that we can do just about anything, and that maybe we are completely free. But then you also describe that still we seem to conform to this idea that love should be the ultimate goal of life and that this leads us into coupledom. So this does seem like a restriction, and you also describe how sexuality also defines us in a social order, how it defines us in terms of an identity. So I was wondering if you could say something about where you think at this specific moment with technology and visuality impacting sexuality, where our lack of freedom lies, so where the pressure on our sexuality is the strongest. And then coupled to that, I was just curious, I was fantasizing myself about what kind of forms of sexual expression now are the ones that we might find the most liberating or inspiring, since there is so much out there crying out freedom.
Yeah, the first one, what was the first question? Just how you...
Yeah, where we are not free.
Where we are not free. So I think many people, and I include myself in this, you know, when I started the book, I thought of myself as a very open-minded person because I really didn't feel judgmental about anybody else's life. But I think where we're not free is often when it comes to our own set of preferences. And if you'd asked me 5 years ago, you know, why don't you watch internet porn, for example, I would be like, well, I think it's more for men than for women, or I think, you know, like I'm not a visually stimulated person, or I had all these theories, all of which were like not tested really, and we're all kind of informed by the fact that at the end of the day I had an idea of what like a good and proper sexuality looked like, and it was easier for me to think of my own sexual identity as just like happening to conform that way than actually you know, testing it and exploring it. And I think that's true for a lot of people. I think so much of our sense of our own freedom doesn't come from all of the possibilities that are out there, but actually about, you know, the conversation you have to have with your aunt at Christmas about who you're dating and why you haven't gotten married yet. I think those little casual conversations actually cause us to police ourselves in more ways than we might realize.
So we do internalize a lot of restrictions that we're not aware of. Yeah. And looking at this landscape, that you've explored this landscape of all kinds of sexual expression that are all out there. Does this also? I got this feeling of this postmodern blasé feeling of, okay, so anything goes. So then it immediately also becomes less. It seems to become less urgent that we have pornography and that we have internet dating because it's all accessible to us already. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on forms of sexual expression that still surprise us, or that still challenges also to think about sexuality in new ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think many people think of a sexual life as two people in a bedroom are in some kind of relationship with each other. And, you know, it's so much more than that. You know, exploring your sexuality doesn't need to be going on 100 Tinder dates or like Grindr dates or whatever is your thing. You can read books. There are workshops. Yeah, there are things like tantric sex and new communities that form around sexual practice that isn't based in romance or the couple. There's just a lot of modes. One woman I interviewed for the book identified as internet sexual, which meant that she preferred mediated live webcam interactions to actually being in a couple with somebody or being physically intimate with somebody. So like, and there's going to be a proliferation of those kinds of interactions as virtual reality gets better and all of this kind of stuff. So that, you know, sex, and I actually find this a comforting thought, you know, because you never know, oops, what happened? When you're going to end up alone and single. And it's kind of nice to know that you can engage with a sexuality that goes beyond just like dating and romance or coupledom. Yeah.
Do we already have any questions from you over there? Anyone? Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, in the course of writing the book, I let myself watch porn, for the purpose of sexual stimulation, and yes, it works. It works. Which was like, it just, I was raised of a generation that saw porn as somehow innately anti-feminist, that pornography objectified women, that it showed a kind of violence in interactions, and that was a theory that manifested in practice in the real world. And some of that is true, but that's not innate to porn. There's no monolithic entity called pornography. Pornography is just sexually stimulating material. It doesn't have any inherent qualities beyond that. It can be a person popping balloons with a stiletto. People have all kinds of things. So, what I realized is that if porn was somehow seen as anti-feminist, it's kind of an intellectual dead end, because then what does a literal depiction of feminist sex look like? It has to involve images of sex, or it can't just be like a stream meeting another stream, or some of these phrases you actually heard in the 80s when this movement came up. So yeah, for me, allowing myself a life of sexual fantasy was part of a process of self-criticism and self-liberation. I think on the other side of it, I'm less, these all of these things on the internet to make women feel safe. I'm less interested in those. I'm not scared of a dick pic, and I'm not, yeah. A lot of times when misogynistic people attack a woman on the internet, they'll use the language of pornography, because it's kind of seen as this like cloistered space that's the domain of the man, and a man can assert his masculinity by like bringing pornography out into the world. And I think the more we break down those walls, the less effective that kind of attack can be. Yeah.
We have to tap into that. I was wondering, a week ago I saw a newspaper article describing how, in response to all of the debates surrounding the Me Too campaign, a museum in Manchester had taken out a lot of nudes, female nudes, from the museum to make a point. To counter the male gaze inherent in these very old paintings of reclining naked women. I think we all know the images of naked Venuses reclining on a bed somewhere. And then a great number of artists responded against that, claiming that it's important to keep politically incorrect or misogynist art, and also claiming the right for artists to make dirty art, to make wrong art, to make offensive art. So we seem to be stuck in a discussion where we are assessing if expressions of sexuality are good or bad. I'm thinking myself about ways to get out of this. And Nishant, do you want to add to that?
Mhm. Mhm. Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that's something I was trying to work out as I wrote the book. How, within sexual freedom, do you make sure that your life is not just a series of like instant one off interactions? How do you build something over time within that freedom? If you identify to the world as an individual instead of part of a couple and you're having sex, how do you make sure that like the relationships you're having have kindness and care? How do you form communities where you take care of each other when you're sick? And you know, the answers to a lot of these questions can be found in communities where marriage was denied. So I think, you know, in terms of sexual freedom, queer communities offer probably the most ideas and vocabulary about post-nuclear family life. But that said, I also think you don't have to decide on an identity for the rest of your life. You know, after I finished the book, I just like got lucky. I fell in love. Now I'm in like a kind of semi-monogamous relationship where we live together and all that. And but that doesn't need to be like a lifelong identity. That's the phase I'm in now. But I find a lot of, again, just comfort from having explored all these other options, because I know if that doesn't work out or something happens in the future, it's nice to know that I have, I know now how to look for lifestyles that offer comfort and support, even if it doesn't look like a long-term relationship.
Thanks. And maybe that might help connect back to Isis's question, because I thought that's the thing, right? That, sorry, thank you. I was saying that might help connect back to the question that in the context of the Me Too movement and the kind of political correctness of sexual desire,
Yeah.
which has become such a part of our consent conversations, for instance. I thought the whole point of finding sexual emancipation was your capacity and your right to be provoked.
Right.
Right? Like my capacity to be provoked cannot be taken away in the name of gentrification and political correctness. And I want to bring it back to questions of art, free speech, and expression then. And what do we do with dirty art? That what if it's willfully, consciously, politically incorrect because the role it had was to actually provoke a response of a certain kind?
Yeah, I mean the problem, I don't know about this particular instance in Manchester, but you know the problem with that, it goes back to some of the questions I bring up here, is that it's not liberation, it's censorship, and sexual liberation has to include some depiction of sex. It can't just hide sex. It has to allow for its existence. It's not you know, it's not more liberated if you just like pretend, you know, ban the shirtless bathroom selfie or the nude sculpture. But I do think there, you know, as we're working out what like a respectful sexual depiction looks like, there's a lot of room there that art, you know, even in the stuff we saw this morning, a lot of artists are exploring those themes.
Yes. Any other questions, perhaps? Yes, Anna Maria.
Hi. First, I mean, it's more like comments or thoughts what I want to say. First of all, I just wanted to stay for 1 second with this question that came, whether you watch porn. I mean, it's a legit question, and it's not my business because it wasn't directed to me. But at the same time, I thought its ambivalence was quite interesting because it wasn't clear if the question was, do you get off at porn, or what do you think about porn?
Yeah.
And I think this is important in a public context where also this is a question from a male direct to female. I presume you're a male, I'm not sure. So sorry if I'm wrong. And it's all again fine, but it is something perhaps to underline. And similarly, again, if I may, with all respect to your work, I wanted to say that you keep referring back to the dick picture and the shirtless picture of the guy. I think an extreme example of contemporary censorship is the censorship of female nipples online.
Yes.
Big time.
Yeah.
So I think it's actually extremely important to underline the particular censorship that goes onto female bodies. And to wrap this up by saying that liberation, as you very well pointed out, certain notions of liberation or empowerment can very much come with a certain conservatism, like the clean aesthetics you were talking about that I absolutely agree with. So they have certain complexities. that they really need to be looked into. Because again, then what is offensive for whom? And I'm personally, I don't know if you saw my presentation, but my work can be offensive to people, yeah? So I'm not someone who is gonna stand for, I don't know, some sort of generalized universal cleanliness or whatever. But at the same time, I think it's important to see who is talking about what. Everyone has the right to say what disturbs them. And this doesn't mean they are less sexually anything.
No, I mean, we all, we carry the pathologies of our society, that manifests in our sexuality. And so, I'm not saying that Bumble, for example, should allow anything goes, because I do think people should be respectful of the baseline of what's considered safe and all of that. But yeah, as in speaking into the censorship of women's bodies, the shirtless selfie obviously applies to women too. And not only that, on that app in particular, you can only wear a swimsuit if you're at the beach or in a swimming pool in your photo. If you if you wear a swimsuit in your house and you take a photo of it, man or woman, they delete it. So yeah, it's a kind of question of finding some line between respect and censorship. And as far as porn goes, I mean, when I said it, I didn't watch porn before. I meant I didn't try to get off to it. So yeah, I had seen porn before. And, I think it's important for people to explore what sexually stimulates them. I think it's an important part of being a sexually aware human is being able to name a fantasy that you have. And before I started writing the book, I just was like, I don't know, sex is a kind of magic. When it's good, it's good. When it's bad, it's bad. But I don't think about it. It's not a thing that I can study. And what I would like to emphasize is it's always, none of us have a natural identity. All of our sexual identities are constructed, and it's worthwhile to undertake a course of personal inquiry about why first of all, for some people it's as basic as naming what turns you on and being able to use a search term, which I think is important. And then, where that comes from and what cultural story is being told. And you might find that you don't know your own reality as well as you thought.
Also, just to add to your websites, FetLife is really cool.
Yeah, FetLife is, a lot of my friends are on FetLife. And I think that speaks to FetLife, for people who don't know it, is like a kinky social network. And again, it gets past the gender divide because it addresses a very specific community, which tends to be like BDSM and open relationship crowd, and it's very sensitive to their vocabulary and ethics of consent and all of those things. And when a sex-forward website uses those terms and addresses those communities, the gender divide isn't as bad as it would be on like Adult Friend Finder.
Yes, I think I have a final question. I'm making it up as I go along. So in your book you describe the utopian feelings that arise when technology comes and we think there's going to be a future of sex and it's going to be radically different. There will be science fiction and there will be sexuality like we've never known it before. And then you also express a sense of disillusionment in that, yes, there is a future, but it's not as radically different. If I taste the book right, as we might have imagined it, I think often technology turns out to reproduce cultural frames we have more than we want to. I think this also pertains to the dick pics that are more available to us than the tit pics. And then at the same time I'm thinking now, because we're in a room full of artists, young artists, people making work that is on one hand part of that cultural realm of producing expressions of sexuality, but art also often has strategies to counter it or to go along with it in such a radical way that we can change something, to imagine new forms for something that we need new forms for. Um, I'm not sure after reading your book what you would hope or wish from the world, but what is there any advice you could give to young artists to what they might want to do or explore or use art for when they're dealing with sexuality?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's and I write this in the book. I think there's a machine bias to futurism, that people think futurism is spaceships and robots and cell phones, and really, it's when you look at what has changed, it tends to be often more or just as much about social arrangements. So gender identity, the way we form families and households, the way we structure our relationships, all of that has been shifting dramatically in the past 50 years. And if I were an artist interested in these questions, I mean, the work, I was only here for Julius's performance or talk, but he, you know, he's playing with stereotypes of masculinity and symbols of masculinity and subverting them and messing around with them in a way that creates then a space to show how artificial or constructed those spaces are. So there's all kinds of room to do that, and many artists are, you know, documenting new forms of community. I'm working on an article right now about Wolfgang Tillmans, who I'm sure, the photographer, who I'm sure many of you know, and his work, when you consider it as a body, it really he's gay, and he's really involved with nightlife culture, and he's, through his work over the years, just documented a different kind of family and a different sexual ethics that are not rooted in like ideas of the Bible or yeah. So there's lots of artists working on articulating that, and that I should have mentioned that DTF campaign, that's the work of Maurizio Catalan. So artists are actually cooperating with these companies too sometimes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.